Hey guys, this is Chris with Drop Dice. I decided that I was probably going to end up doing two videos this week because I really got to thinking about a couple things. I took a break off of like doing hangouts and stuff like that I normally do, um, and during that break time, I started watching Netflix, and it got me originally thinking about the video I did earlier today, talking about splitting the party and maybe what effective ways you could do that. The other thing that it got me thinking about is frankly, a lot of us inside the hobby are adults, and there seems to be a large amount of targeting towards let's get kids involved, let's do something for children, let's get like the kids over at the youth center involved in gaming and stuff like that. And maybe it's because I don't have kids, but I don't really care. That which isn't exactly true. To be honest, it's I do care. It's just that stuff doesn't really fit me at all. And so what I got to thinking about it was, what if we instead started thinking about stuff like how to appropriately incorporate adult themes into your game. And so for me, I typically run grimdark fantasy, and they usually do have adult themes inside there, but I'm never really super overt. I'm more like regular cable TV. I'm talking about how would you like properly execute HBO gritty, we're going to show you some gore kind of stuff. Like a lot of people love Game of Thrones, and they're like, "Oh, I want to play Game of Thrones. I want to do a Song of Ice and Fire, the game," but their game never really has that adult theme that the TV show really shows going on in it. So I wanted to kind of break it down into a couple of categories, and these are categories that movies and things like that are based upon. And there are things that I plan on integrating into Legend of the Five Rings. We just have had such few games so far that it just hasn't come up yet. I do typically go a little bit more adult themed with Legend of the Five Rings. I think it's a very adult setting, and so it fits appropriately. But let's start with one of the more frequent ones that comes up. Um, is there tends to be uh, different issues that are like social issues, but one of the ones that comes up that it seems like a lot of people are moderately okay with touching upon is children in bad situations. Some people have a very hot button topic about that sort of thing. And hold on a sec, he's about to bark. Okay, good. Um, it, Children being in bad situations can be a hot button topic. So let me preface this video with, if you intend to pursue any of these adult themes, I would recommend a session zero or a simple discussion where you talk to your players and say, hey, I'm interested in pursuing a couple of adult themes. What would you guys not be interested in? So if you have a player that's like, hey, I'm okay if like children are in a bad situation, maybe getting abused, but I don't really want to have like a game that goes overly in detail about it. And I'm fine with that. That gives me something I can work with. So if I want to do like a situation where like an orphanage burned down and now there's ghosts of orphans that are waiting to be adopted, and you come to find out that the person who was caretaking after the orphanage was beating the children and doing a bunch of other vile things, and the players have to figure out a way to make these children come to rest, then I think that that's actually a game worth pursuing. Not everything is sunshine, rainbows, and we slay the dragon and save the day is kind of my thinking on it. I think that should be somewhere in there because your players deserve to win and their characters should be heroes, but it doesn't mean that their journey is going to be entirely perfect. For example, there are some reinterpretations of like the Wizard of Oz and some like rewritten versions where like Dorothy is an abused child and is escaping to Oz as like a hallucination to cope with a bad situation at home. Alice in Wonderland, there's a couple of remakes where that's basically the same thing that's happening. Not to say that those remakes are good or anything, because some of them are pretty poor, but you get the basic idea that just applying a slightly more sadistic touch to it can really change the tone of your game. Um, so I would, so like bad stuff happening to kids, I'm going to say is like our first item on the list here. And I think that that one can be used with a light touch and still get the adult themes that you want out of it without having to go into details. Like, you don't need to explain everything that happened to that kid, so long as your players understand the relevance of what you're talking about. So if you wanted to go full adult theme, you could blatantly lay out to your players and be like, hey, this kid was sexually molested. And some players, like I said, will have a problem with that. So make sure you talk to people before you bring up a plot like that, because you may lose a player by doing so. And ultimately, the games are about having fun. And so sometimes storylines like that, if it will make people feel uncomfortable, are not worth it. So just as kind of heads up on that. But so we've got bad stuff happening to kids and the many tones that can come with that. Now, violence is a weird one. Inside games, if you really think about it, they are actually generally pretty violent, but we never get into the full details of how violent or extreme the cases may be. You know, you may talk about like the arrow sinking in and pushing through to the other side or something like that, but that's not necessarily the violence that I'm going on about. Like you have moments like in the Provokers where they do the cutscene and you see the Corruptor, and the Corruptor is like talking with one of his cohorts, and he gets the scene where he like kills his cohort and everything, and it's like, yeah, he cuts him down, and that's kind of it. And I understand Provokers is more of a PG-13, but if you wanted like the HBO Provokers, like, wouldn't it be so much cooler if like you went to go see who the Provoker was? You found like a camp that he abandoned, and inside his camp are people that were boiled alive for like disobeying his orders, and you're coming in and all you can hear is like the screams, and they're so far cooked that you can do nothing to save them. Even magic really won't help them at this point, unless you're going to try and resurrect them once they finally die. You know, you can put characters in kind of a weird situation with like gratuitous violence or like torture and things like that, where it almost seems like the better option is to simply provide a graceful end to it all. Another thing that kind of goes along with violence and death and things like that is I'm a big fan of suicides in games, not because it's necessarily a controversial topic, but it can help make a statement. In Legend of the Five Rings, especially, if someone commits seppuku or kills themselves ritually, it's a big political statement. It's known and things like that. Now, other games like Dungeons and Dragons, Fantasy Age, and things like that that are not set up to where like there's a cultural understanding of what suicide is. If your players happen to come across a tavern, and let's say they open the door, they know nothing about this place, and inside they see a dude hanging from the ceiling that's been there for about a week. He smells terrible. Like his house looks like it's pretty decent shape because he just kind of stopped functioning and decided to kill himself. It could be as simple as that's just something they come across and they have to deal with. Maybe they have to cut him down and give him a burial if they choose to, or they could just throw him out the window and feed him to the wolves, whatever the players really ultimately decide. But it does provide you an interesting thing if players decide to look into it. So if you do decide to use stuff like that, I do recommend understanding why that person would have killed themselves. Because if a player asks you, you don't want it to be like, magic. It really will help the adult theming and content shine through and make it feel more realistic. Now, just like with the whole child being put into bad situations one, I think violence needs to be with a touch too. If you get too far down the spectrum, you end up with an 80s slasher flick, and it's almost ridiculous because it's like, oh, every scene someone dies. That's kind of my problem with Game of Thrones is, you know, everybody talks about it, is as soon as you start to maybe like a character, that character's dead. It doesn't matter. Gone. Or messed up, or mangled, or maimed. But I wouldn't go to that extreme. Like, there's a really awesome entry from Play Dirty by John Wick where he talks about a character who created a weakness that she had to care for her mother, and it was a superhero game. Well, what the villain did is the villain came in, attacked, and killed her mother to test her, basically, as a player character, to push those limits and those envelopes. So that, it's not just that, masked madman destroys the city. It's masked madman goes in with a purpose to kill your mother because masked madman knows your identity now. It's really heavy, and I think that bringing something like that into a game actually has a really solid effect. So one of my suggestions is, if you do choose to use violence or any of these tactics, really, I would really recommend looking at your character's backgrounds, flaws, disadvantages, whatever your system has, because almost every system has something like that. And if not, most players produce a background anyways, which is part of the reason I discourage players from doing the "I'm an orphan and I don't love anybody and nobody loves me" kind of backstories, because it's just silly. If that does happen, a creative way to get around that and produce a interesting story is to kill a player. It sounds crazy, and I know a lot of GMs are kind of against that, but there's no problem in killing a player so long as it meets storyline reasons. If you want to play a game where you funnel characters, that's cool. It's not my thing, but I like character deaths that mean things. The best example I have is in Dragonlance when Flint dies. It's a big thing. Like, the whole party has this sad moment. And there's almost a chapter dedicated to Flint's death and funeral. And I've seen it happen in a game before. In fact, this last game I did with everybody who's playing L5R, there were a couple soldiers that died, and they did a big funeral. Of course, the funeral was attacked by an aboleth, because there was something going on in the world that caused this aboleth to push forward on them. But it was a really powerful scene because they made up funeral traditions for their people. They buried him at sea, and it was actually another player character that really set in motion this drive for the players to want to have a fluid scene of funeral. And that's another adult level content. It's like the coping with death, not just gratuitous violence, but it's more like the understanding and being able to recognize and apply death in a realistic fashion. Another one of the themes that you could do inside there is drugs. Drugs come up in L5R because opium is around and all over the place. It's not like overt, but it is out there, and there are opium dens and things like that. I would definitely carry that over to other RPGs. And there are some people who use drugs as a venue for like demonic influence and things like that. And I think that's a good place to start. But I've always been interested by the character who's addicted to a substance. Not necessarily because, it's a flaw that gives you penalties when you're not doped up and it's funny, ha ha ha, I'm a druggie. I'm more interested in the character's struggle with their addiction. A movie I just watched, Outcast, with Hayden Christensen and somebody else. It's on Netflix. Outcast, he's addicted to opium in there, and he has to kind of balance this addiction and this like insatiable desire to get himself high, to be able to battle off the demons of his past from when he was a crusader. And it gets him in trouble during the story. And in fact, I like that way of doing a disadvantage of addiction much better than a statistical disadvantage for either using it or not using it. I think generally drugs in a game are almost more powerful as a story item than they are as a statistical item. Like, maybe if you're high or on a substance, you get disadvantage if you're playing D&D, because that's an easy way to do it. But I don't think you necessarily need like -2 charisma, -4 strength until the drug wears off. It always seemed weird to me that it was like a super statistical thing, because you have people that like will take PCP and they're just their pain resistance is gone. So it doesn't make sense for me to be like, oh, statistically he gets -2 con because he's doing drugs and he thinks he's a monster crashing through parties and stuff like that. Just no logic behind it. But maybe making it a little bit more story focused. And I think that's kind of the key with all these adult themes is not necessarily like the mechanics behind it, but more the story behind it and how that evolves your overall story. Another theme that I have that I really like is something that doesn't come up as often as I'd like in a positive light, and that's failure. Um, Failures, especially in movies and TV shows, they tend to be big, dramatic setbacks. And players typically rebel against those. They don't really like them. And so I think the best way to handle that is if you have a player and you want to be like, hey, I would like to do this story where I'm going to set your character back pretty far. This is what I would like to do. He's basically going to lose everything. And, you know, he's been searching for his daughter. He finally found her. And maybe she's a bad guy now, or maybe she gets killed in front of him, and now he has to reassess everything because his entire journey up to this point was finding his daughter and making sure she was safe. But now she's gone. Who is he? And things like that. And if you have a player who approaches that with a very adult manner in mind in it, I think it could be a really compelling story. So I would like to see stuff like that happen. Again, same basic principle. Use it with light touches. Don't go crazy. And then the last one I have is sex. Sex is a weird category to me because I don't like sex to be on camera. Like, I like that it happens in the world and it makes sense, but like it always feels weird to me being on camera unless it's a scene like they go into a whorehouse and there's like half naked women everywhere and the room smells of like a distinct dank smoke and you're kind of describing the scene and it makes sense in that context. But like I don't need Book of Vile Seduction or whatever you want to call it busted out so that I can roll on 18 charts to figure out if she got pregnant and if it had demon blood in it and how that baby's going to turn out like to be the antichrist of this game or whatever because of a roll chart. That seems unnecessary to me. But like going into the validity of underground establishments seems like a really cool way to highlight kind of these adult tones that you can have inside your game. Like I said, you go into a whorehouse and describe it for what it is. Don't sugarcoat it and make it like, you know, the Bunny Ranch where everybody's like having a good time drinking. There's like women that are dressed with their goods on display but not really like showing anything. Like I would say, like, you know, have some naked woman run by like giggling as like a fat guy smacks her on the ass and chases her through the room, and there's like a bunch of people that are doing drugs and drinking, and there's scantily clad women and pillows and stuff like that, and the place just stinks of sex and drugs. I think that's kind of a cool way to do it, and you just don't see it a lot because generally on the YouTube games, people are pretty PG-13. I think generally in the future I'm going to change that, and I'm going to be a little bit more HBO style R, I guess, or what is it, MC-17 or something like that, whatever the TV rating is. I always forget, but I think adding that can really set the tone of your game. Now, if you want your game like that all the time, it could become a little dry. So I would recommend using these adult tones when appropriate. But like just because you go down the street, you don't need to make it like dark and grisly and all that stuff. Game of Thrones is actually a really great example because there are moments where Game of Thrones just feels like a standard epic fantasy and it doesn't feel super dark. And then when it gets dark, it's like serious time. The camera changes, like you can see it in how the cameras worked. And how you can emulate that as a DM is change your phrasing. Like, let's say, you know, you're on a happy-go-lucky adventure, you use your standard style, but when you go into adult mode, like my usual thing is I lean in a little bit closer and I'll describe the scene like this. Like I'm much closer to my camera when I do it, and my tone will change. I'll get a little bit more flat and my inflection will kind of go away, and I'll describe the seedy thieves tavern that they found, or maybe the whorehouse or whatever it is. Another good idea that you could do to kind of show this adult content is make political choices matter and make them have a cost. Like that's the big thing about being an adult in the real world is your choices matter. And in D&D, that's always kind of a thing. Your choices matter, but to be honest, there's a lot of choices that don't matter. Like, you know, you could convince them to help you fight the orcs, or you could fight them on your own. And it does matter because if they fight the orcs with you, your chances of success are going to be much easier. You can instead attack the main forces and go after the siege leader. Whereas if you were to attack alone, it probably would be best to go do guerrilla warfare and disrupt supply lines, things like that. I'm talking about choices where it's like there's no good answer. It's like, you know, we can go to war and thousands of lives could be cost, or like in my newest L5R game, you can condone a blood feud, which a blood feud will not cost thousands of lives, but may cost a couple hundreds to be complete before either family calls it off. And it becomes a question of, you know, do we do what's good for the greater good? One of the games that I played recently, a Numenera game, I think it would have been better as a campaign rather than a one-shot, but the idea was you lived in a very totalitarian utopian society where if you obeyed the rules, everything was good. But like the rules had gotten so crazy, they were taxing us immensely. And when we go to find the president of this company that's in charge of the town, he basically lays out, you know, join me. You can live here amongst the privileged. But if you kill me and you upset the balance, the people are just going to descend into anarchy and they may lose their lives. Defiance on Sci-Fi, that was one of their themes during the show, was this idea of civilized life that has a cost and very, very freedom restrictive, or the walls could fall and you would be open to whatever's out there. Stuff like that is pretty cool to highlight in your games. And then the last one that I would recommend giving a shot. This one's probably on the lightest of scales. I think Bad Stuff to Children is probably pretty similar, where it can be done really lightly and still have a lot of effect. Is Man versus Blank. Man versus Nature is probably my favorite, or Man versus Spirituality, because it basically the players have to think in a very realistic sense. You know, what I'm doing has a cost, and what that cost actually ends up being. So like when players fight the Fae, it shouldn't ever be, oh look, it's the Fae, they're wild monsters and they come from the Fae wild, and they've got these weird plant creatures with them. It should never be as simple as that. It should be like the Fae is fighting for a reason, and a player who asks and finds out what it is, and they come to terms with this question of, you know, man versus nature, because that's what the Fae ultimately is it's untamed wild nature. And in the material world that players come from is usually a tamed, civilized world of what the Fae world could have been. And I think that question needs to come up more. Another great example, like I said, is Man versus Spirituality. If you know you have gods in your world, maybe those gods are fully dependent on the people, and maybe they have to interact with them. They're not just distant gods. Think about the Greek myths. Sorry about that. So essentially, yeah, like Greek myths, the gods themselves are around. They are interfering. They're doing things inside the world, and you know, maybe that's something that the players have to deal with and understand and come to terms with, or even they can rebel against. Stuff like that, I think, would be fun to pursue. It doesn't necessarily have to be HBO level. You could go for like cable adult TV kind of level. One of the TV shows that I think does a pretty good job of showing adult themes without necessarily getting carried away, even though I don't like the show, is actually Once, which is that Disney show that it's people that are in there. It's talks about like it's a what if world about Storybook Maine, and essentially it's all the people from Disney inside a multiverse theory kind of thing, and they present a lot of really good solid adult topics without necessarily all of the weight that could come with them. So that would be a good place to look to kind of get some ideas and inspiration. I think I've made this video long enough. I tried to promise that I would do shorter videos, but I think adult content inside the YouTube world is not super highlighted. So I figured I wanted to go into some details and provide examples. There's a whole ton of examples out there, and frankly, if you want some great ones, check out YouTube, literature, anything, and you'll be able to find some great ones to really play with and explore on your own. And if you have any ideas on things you'd like to see in Legend of the Five Rings as far as like adult content goes, feel free to comment in this video or even a future video if something sparks your imagination and I mentioned that, you know, the blood feud that's going on. You're like, oh, you know what you should really do with this? You should try this. I'm totally open to that stuff. So as always, guys, feel free to like, share, comment, subscribe. And I thank you guys for tuning in. It's been kind of a rough week, but I'm glad to be kind of getting the ball rolling again. I put out some more stuff for Providence, so check that out at the website, dropdice.com. Other than that, guys, I will see you in the next video. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you at the gaming table.